Before the silence, there was the bell. For 12 years, the world of Stefan Pavlov had been measured by its sound. It was a deep, resonant clang that rolled down from the wooden belfry of the small Orthodox church, across the cobbled lanes of his Bulgarian village, and into the very marrow of his bones. The bell marked the rhythm of his life, the call to morning prayers that stirred him from his straw-filled mattress, the midday toll that signaled a brief rest from mending nets with his father, and the evening vespers that promised the scent of his mother's stew and the warmth of the family hearth. The world was the rough texture of the sheep's wool he helped card, the sharp, clean smell of pine in the forests above the village, and the smooth, cool stone of the church floor beneath his knees. It was the taste of wild strawberries, their sweetness bursting on his tongue, and the weight of his mother's hand on his head as she whispered a blessing. Her hands were calloused from a life of work, but to Stefan, they were the softest things he knew. On a day in the spring of 1550, the bell was silent. It was not a silence of peace, but one of apprehension. A different sound had replaced it, the dull, rhythmic thud of horses' hooves and the clink of metal. They had come, the collectors, the Devşirme officials. Fear, a cold and greasy thing, coiled in the village square. Doors were barred, shutters were drawn. Mothers clutched their sons, their knuckles white, their whispered prayers a frantic buzz beneath the sudden, heavy stillness. Stefan's mother, Elena, pulled him into the darkest corner of their small home, her body a trembling shield. They look for the strongest, the brightest. His father, Pavel, muttered, his face grim as he peered through a crack in the door. The best of the flock, attacks of blood. The pounding on their door was not a request. It was a command that splintered the wood and their world. Two men pushed their way in. One was a Janissary, tall and impassive in his distinctive uniform, his face a mask of practiced indifference. The other was an Aga, a man whose soft silk robes and plump, ringed fingers belied the predatory sharpness in his eyes. He scanned the room, his gaze dismissing Pavel's weathered strength and Elena's desperate defiance, before it landed on Stefan. Stefan was tall for his age, with a shock of light brown hair and eyes the color of a summer sky, a stark contrast to the dark, earthy tones of his people. He was quick-witted, the first to learn his letters from the village priest, his mind as sharp as his father's fishing knife. He was, in every way, the best of the flock. The Aga glided towards him, his movements unervingly smooth. He took Stefan's chin in his hand, tilting his head to the light. The man's fingers were cold, and they smelled faintly of jasmine and something else, something metallic and unsettling. He ran a thumb over Stefan's cheek, inspected his teeth, and appraised his slender, strong frame as a merchant would appraise colt. "This one," the Aga said, his voice soft, almost a caress, yet it carried the finality of a death sentence. Elena let out a choked sob, a sound that was ripped from her soul. She lunged forward, but the Janissary's arm shot out, a bar of iron holding her back. Pavel moved to stand beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his face a canvas of impotent rage and crushing sorrow. "He is only a boy," Pavel pleaded, his voice cracking. "My only son." The Aga smiled, a fleeting, cruel expression. "The Sultan honors your family. Your son will serve in the palace. He will have a life of splendor you cannot imagine." Stefan didn't understand the words, but he understood the finality in the Aga's tone. He understood the Janissary's grip on his arm, pulling him away from his mother's reach. He saw his mother's face, contorted in a silent scream, her eyes wide with a horror that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He saw his father, a strong man broken, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He was dragged from the only world he had ever known. The scent of pine and wood smoke was replaced by the dust of the road and the sweat of horses. The sound of the church bell was lost to the clink of his own small chains. His name, Stefan Pavlov, son of Pavel, was the last piece of his old life he held onto. But he knew, with the chilling certainty of a child forced to become a man in a single, brutal moment, that they would take that from him too. The silence that followed was the sound of his childhood being erased. The journey to Istanbul was a crucible, a brutal filter designed to smelt away the weak. Stefan was no longer Stefan. He was a number in a long, shuffling line of stolen boys, a human tithe paid to an unseen emperor. They marched for weeks, their small feet, accustomed to the soft earth of forests and fields, blistering and bleeding on the hard, sun-baked roads of the Ottoman heartland. They were a river of sorrow flowing towards the capital. Their Christian names and native tongues, Bulgarian, Serbian, Greek, Armenian, drowned out by the harsh Turkish commands of their guards. To speak in the language of their mothers was to earn a lash from a leather whip, a stinging reminder that their past was a crime. The first boy to fall was a Greek named Leonidas, his face flushed with fever. He collapsed in the dust, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The Janissaries barely broke stride. They nudged him with their boots, and when he didn't stir, they simply moved on, leaving him for the vultures that circled patiently overhead. There was no burial, no prayer. His existence was erased as easily as a footprint in the sand. Stefan learned his first lesson of this new world. Compassion was a liability. To care was to feel the pain of another's loss, adding it to the unbearable weight of his own. He learned to harden his heart, to build a wall around the memory of his mother's face. He focused on the mechanics of survival, the rhythm of his own breathing, the placement of one foot in front of the other, the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. Food was a thin, watery gruel ladled once a day into their cupped hands. It was never enough. The boys, once sons of proud families, were reduced to the primal instincts of animals. Stefan, small but swift, learned to jostle for a better position in the food line, to guard his meager portion with a ferocity that surprised him. He saw a boy from a neighboring village, a gentle soul named Ivan, have his crust of bread snatched from his hands by a larger, more desperate boy. Ivan didn't fight back, he just sat and wept silently. The next day, Ivan was gone. Yet, in the midst of this dehumanizing ordeal, flickers of humanity persisted. At night, huddled together for warmth against the chilling desert air, they would communicate in whispers, a forbidden patchwork of broken languages and gestures. Stefan found a quiet kinship with a Serbian boy named Miloš, whose eyes held the same haunted look as his own. They didn't speak of their families. The pain was too raw. Instead, they shared slivers of their former lives, the taste of a favorite food, the song of a familiar bird, the name of a stream where they used to swim. These were not conversations. They were offerings, small pieces of their souls shared in the darkness to prove they still existed. One night, Miloš, shivering with a fever that reminded Stefan of Leonidas, pressed a small, smooth stone into Stefan's palm. "From the Dina River," he whispered in a raspy, forbidden tongue. "For luck." Stefan clutched the stone, its coolness a tangible link to a world where luck was something more than just waking up the next morning. The arrival in Istanbul was an assault on the senses. After the bleak emptiness of the road, the city was a chaotic explosion of color, sound, and smell. The domes and minarets of 1,000 mosques pierced the sky, their golden tips gleaming in the sun. The air was thick with the scent of spices, salt water, and humanity. Crowds of people speaking the conqueror's tongue swirled around them, their faces a mixture of curiosity, pity, and contempt. They were marched through the city gates, a spectacle of conquest for the residents of the imperial capital. They were no longer just boys. They were symbols of the Sultan's reach, living proof of his dominion over the Christian lands. They were taken to a large, foreboding complex of buildings, where the process of their unmaking would be formalized. Here, in a sterile stone courtyard, they were stripped of the last vestiges of their old lives. An official with a ledger and an inkpot stood before them, his voice a droning monotone. Stefan Pavlov was gone. In his place stood Süleyman, a name that felt alien on his tongue, a mask he was now forced to wear. Miloš became Murad. The others received new, Turkish names, each one a nail in the coffin of their former identity. Their ragged clothes were taken and burned. Their heads were shaved, the soft hair his mother had loved to stroke falling to the stone floor in dusty clumps. They were herded into a bathhouse, the hammam, where attendants scrubbed them with harsh soap and rough cloths, scouring away not just the grime of the journey, but the very scent of their homes. It was a baptism of fire and water, a violent purification that prepared them for entry into the sacred, profane world of the Sultan's palace. As the water sluiced over his body, Stefan, now Süleyman, clutched the small stone from the Dina River, a secret he guarded with the last shred of his will. It was the only piece of his past they hadn't taken. The Enderun school, nestled within the third courtyard of the Topkapi Palace, was called the Palace of the Interior. It was a world unto itself, a place of profound and terrifying contradictions. It was a prison of unparalleled luxury and an academy of immense prestige. Here, boys were honed into the sharpest instruments of the state, their minds filled with poetry, theology, and law, even as their spirits were systematically broken. Süleyman's life was now governed by a rigid, unyielding schedule. The day began before dawn with the first call to prayer, followed by cold baths meant to cool the humors and suppress the burgeoning urges of adolescence. Breakfast was a silent, monitored affair where the slightest breach of etiquette, a dropped spoon, a hurried bite, could earn a sharp rebuke or a stinging blow. The morning hours were dedicated to academic instruction. In high-ceilinged rooms adorned with intricate blue tilework, they learned to write the elegant curves of Arabic calligraphy, to memorize long passages of the Quran, and to debate the finer points of Islamic jurisprudence. They studied Persian poetry, Ottoman history, and the complex mathematics required for military engineering and administration. The quality of the education rivaled any university in Christendom, yet its purpose was singular: to create a class of administrators and soldiers whose loyalty was absolute, whose minds were shaped entirely by and for the Ottoman state. Süleyman, with his quick mind, excelled. He learned the languages, mastered the calligraphy, and absorbed the doctrines. It was a refuge of a sort. In the cool logic of mathematics, in the structured beauty of a ghazal, he could find a temporary escape from the suffocating reality of his life. But there was no real escape. The afternoons were for physical training. Archery, horsemanship, wrestling, and the art of wielding the scimitar. The masters were relentless, pushing the boys to the limits of their endurance. Pain was a constant companion, a teacher as demanding as any hoka. A moment's inattention in the wrestling yard meant being thrown hard onto the packed earth. A clumsy move with a sword meant a painful rap from the master's wooden practice blade. But the most important lessons were not taught in the classrooms or on the training grounds. They were learned in the silences, in the stolen glances, in the pervasive atmosphere of surveillance. The dormitories, long chambers lined with narrow beds, offered no privacy. Every movement, every sigh, was observed. The senior pages and eunuchs, who patrolled the corridors at all hours, were the eyes and ears of the palace. They were looking for weakness, for rebellion, for any lingering trace of a boy's former life. They were also looking for beauty. Süleyman quickly learned the perilous art of invisibility. To be too clumsy or dull was to be deemed useless and relegated to menial labor. But to be too beautiful, too graceful, was to attract a different, more dangerous kind of attention. He saw it happen to others. A younger boy named Andres, who had the delicate features of a girl and a singing voice that charmed even the sternest masters, began to receive small gifts from a powerful aga. A piece of sweet lokum, a silk handkerchief. Soon, Andres was summoned to the aga's private chambers at night. He would return in the pre-dawn hours, his eyes hollow, a new and terrible silence about him. The boys learned to communicate in a language of shadows. A slight nod, a downturned gaze, a hand gesture hidden in the folds of a robe. These were their words. They learned to read the subtle shifts in the court's atmosphere, to know which officials were in favor and which were not, whose gaze to meet and whose to avoid. It was a constant, nerve-wracking performance. The palace itself was a geography of power and fear. The first courtyard was public, a bustling space for petitioners and soldiers. The second was for the business of the state, the divan. But the third courtyard, the Enderun, was the heart of the Sultan's private domain. And beyond it, shrouded in legend and mystery, lay the fourth courtyard and the harem, the the domain of the Sultan's women and the black eunuchs who guarded them. For the Ikaglan, the palace pages, the world was a ladder. Every action, every word, every relationship was a step either up or down. At the bottom was disgrace, the dungeons, or the silent finality of the silk cord. At the top was power, wealth, and the Sultan's favor. The men who held power over them, the viziers, the pashas, the chief eunuchs, had all climbed that same ladder. They were products of the same brutal system, survivors who had learned to turn their own trauma into a tool of control. They saw the boys not as children, but as raw material, as younger versions of themselves to be molded, broken, and remade. This was the ultimate paradox of the Enderun. To succeed, a boy had to become the very thing he feared, to internalize the cruelty of his captors and, in time, wield it himself. Süleyman, clutching his river stone in the dark, knew he was walking a tightrope. Every day was a test, a delicate balance between excellence and obscurity, between submission and the preservation of some tiny, secret core of himself. He did not yet know that the system was designed so that, in the end, that core would have to be sacrificed too. The unmaking of a boy into a creature of the palace was a process of deliberate, calculated violation. It came in two forms, the surgeon's blade and the master's caress. Both were designed to sever a boy from his own body, to remake his very nature into something that served the Sultan's will. Süleyman witnessed the first form when he was 14. His friend, Murad, the Serbian boy Miloš, was among those chosen. They were not told what was happening, only that they were being summoned for a special examination. The rumor, a venomous whisper that slithered through the dormitories, was that they were being prepared to become eunuchs, to serve in the harem or as guardians of the palace's inner sanctums. The boys were taken to the palace infirmary, a place usually associated with healing but now thick with an aura of dread. Süleyman saw them go, a line of pale, silent youths, their faces betraying a terror they had been trained to conceal. He did not see Murad again for a week. When he finally returned to the dormitory, he was a ghost. His face was ashen, his movements slow and pained. He walked with a careful, shuffling gait, and his eyes, once filled with a defiant spark, were now vacant pools of unending shadow. The other boys gave him a wide berth, a mixture of fear and a grim, unspoken pity. The procedure was a brutal reality. Performed without anesthesia by surgeons whose primary skill was speed, the mortality rate was horrifyingly high. Ottoman records, in their cold, clinical language, noted that of every 10 boys subjected to castration, 1 or 2 would die immediately from shock or blood loss. Many more would succumb to infection in the days and weeks that followed. The survivors were left with lifelong health complications, from osteoporosis to hormonal imbalances, their bodies forever altered, their connection to a normal future irrevocably severed. The screams from the infirmary became a part of the palace's soundscape, a chilling reminder to the other boys of their absolute powerlessness. Süleyman, who had retained his physical integrity, was destined for a different kind of violation. His intelligence, his fair features, and his graceful bearing had not gone unnoticed. He was chosen for special service by Ferhad Pasha, a powerful vizier who had risen from the Devşirme ranks himself. Ferhad Pasha was a man of immense charm and chilling cruelty, a perfect product of the Enderun. He saw in Süleyman a reflection of his own youthful potential. The grooming began with gifts and favors. Süleyman was moved to a more comfortable chamber, given finer robes and served better food. Ferhad Pasha would summon him to his private apartments to read Persian poetry or play chess. The Pasha would praise his intellect, his skill, his beauty. He spoke of the future, of the great things Süleyman could achieve, of the power he could wield. These moments were intoxicating. For a boy starved of affection and validation, the Pasha's attention felt like a lifeline. It was a dizzying ascent from the anonymity and brutality of the lower ranks. But it was a poisoned chalice. The praise was always followed by a touch, a hand lingering too long on his shoulder, fingers brushing his neck, a proprietary caress that sent a cold shiver down his spine. The nights were the worst. The Pasha would have Süleyman attend to him, serving wine, massaging his feet. The air in the opulent rooms, thick with the scent of incense and perfumed oils, felt suffocating. The Pasha's conversation would become more intimate, his touches more insistent. He would speak of love, of a special bond between master and page, a tradition, he claimed, as old as the great empires of Persia and Greece. Süleyman's mind reeled. This was not the simple, brutal assault he had feared, but a complex web of psychological manipulation. He was being made complicit in his own exploitation. To resist was to spurn the favor of a powerful man, to throw away the future he was being offered, to risk being sent to the dungeons or worse. To submit was to betray the last fragment of himself, the memory of the boy named Stefan. He learned to dissociate, to let his mind float away as the Pasha's hands roamed his body. He would retreat to his mental sanctuary, to the image of the Dina River, to the memory of his mother's lullabies, even as they grew fainter with each passing night. He was a performer, his body an instrument playing a role, while his soul hid in the shadows. This was the nature of power in the palace. It was not just about command and obedience, it was about possession. The Sultan owned their bodies, their minds, and their futures. The viziers and pashas, in turn, owned the boys beneath them, creating a pyramidal structure of exploitation that mirrored the empire's own hierarchy. The system was designed to ensure that no one could claim ownership of themselves. They were all, in their own way, the Sultan's property. Süleyman survived these encounters by becoming a master of the mask. He learned to smile when he wanted to scream, to show gratitude when he felt disgust, to feign devotion when all he felt was a cold, hardening rage. He was learning the most crucial lesson of the Enderun, that to gain power, one had to first surrender it completely, and to live, one had to let a part of oneself die. Years bled into one another, each marked by the relentless rhythm of the palace. The boy Stefan was a ghost, a whisper from another life. In his place stood Süleyman, a young man forged in the crucible of the Enderun. He was no longer a mere page. He was a Hazodali, a member of the Privy Chamber, one of the elite pages who served the Sultan directly. He was 24 years old, and the haunted boy from Bulgaria was buried under layers of silk, steel, and calculated ambition. His patron, Ferhad Pasha, had guided his ascent, but Süleyman's own cunning had secured it. He had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics, to anticipate the Sultan's moods, to wield flattery as a weapon and silence as a shield. He was handsome, intelligent, and utterly loyal, or so it appeared. The mask he had crafted was now his face. The palace was a nest of vipers where alliances shifted like desert sands. Süleyman learned to play the game with chilling proficiency. He saw rivals rise and fall, their careers ending with a quiet transfer to a distant province or, more often, the silent visit of the executioners with their silk cord. He learned that survival depended not just on pleasing those above, but on controlling those below. His moral crisis, long suppressed, came into sharp focus when he was assigned his own retinue of junior pages. A new levy of boys had arrived from the Balkans, their faces pale with the same terror he remembered feeling a lifetime ago. Among them was a boy named Dmitri, from a village not far from his own, whose wide, frightened eyes were a mirror of his own past. One evening, Süleyman found Dmitri weeping in a secluded alcove of the gardens. The boy had been punished for speaking a few words of his native tongue. His back was crisscrossed with angry red welts from the bastinado. "They will kill me," Dmitri whispered, his body shaking. "I cannot forget. I cannot be what they want." Süleyman looked at the boy and saw himself. For a fleeting moment, the walls he had built around his heart crumbled. He felt a surge of a forgotten emotion, empathy. He wanted to comfort the boy, to tell him that he, too, had been Stefan, that he, too, remembered the scent of pine and the sound of a church bell. But the moment passed. The conditioning of the Enderun, the instinct for self-preservation, was stronger. He was Süleyman now, a man of the court. To show weakness, to align himself with this weeping child, was to risk everything he had bled and suffered for. "Your name is not Dmitri," Süleyman said, his voice colder than he intended. "Your name is Murad. Your past is dead. Weep again, and I will ensure your punishment is far worse. The Sultan has no use for weaklings." He turned and walked away, the sound of the boy's stifled sobs following him like a judgment. In that moment, the transformation was complete. The victim had become a perpetrator. He had passed the final, brutal test of the system. He was now a true instrument of the empire, a link in the chain of institutionalized cruelty. He rationalized it as an act of mercy. He was teaching the boy the hard truth of their world, the only lesson that mattered: survive. But as he lay in his own silken bed that night, the face of the weeping boy merged with the memory of his own mother, and for the first time in years, the ghost of Stefan Pavlov stirred, whispering accusations that Süleyman could not silence. His rise continued. He distinguished himself in the Sultan's service, his administrative skills and political acumen earning him more responsibility, more power. He became known for his efficiency and his ruthlessness, a man who could be trusted to carry out the Sultan's will without question or hesitation. He was granted a small estate, given command over a contingent of troops, and was consulted on matters of state. He had become one of the gilded predators he had once feared. He was a success story of the Devşirme, a testament to the system's terrible transformative power. The price had been his soul, and he had paid it in full. Power, Süleyman discovered, was its own form of gilded cage. As a high-ranking official in his late 30s, he commanded respect and fear. He had wealth, influence, and the ear of the Sultan. He had orchestrated military campaigns, negotiated treaties, and condemned men to death with the stroke of a pen. Yet he was more a prisoner than ever, bound by the very system that had elevated him. In 1570, 20 years after he was taken from his home, a diplomatic mission provided an unexpected and unwelcome journey into his past. He was sent as part of an envoy to the Habsburg court in Vienna, a mission that required traveling through the Ottoman provinces of the Balkans. The landscape at first was just territory to be managed, a line on a map. But as the envoy moved deeper into the familiar mountains and valleys of his youth, the buried past began to push its way to the surface. The sight of a shepherd guiding his flock, the sound of a language he had forced himself to forget, the scent of wood smoke from a small village. Each sensory detail was a key unlocking a door in his mind he had long ago bolted shut. The trauma he had so carefully suppressed began to manifest in nightmares. He would wake in the night, his heart pounding, the phantom sensation of the Aga's cold fingers on his chin, the echo of his mother's scream in his ears. During the day, he maintained his stoic composure, the impassive mask of an Ottoman dignitary. But at night, in the privacy of his tent, Süleyman the courtier dissolved, and Stefan the terrified child returned. He began to write. In a small, leather-bound book he had kept hidden for years, he started to document his story, not in the elegant Ottoman Turkish of the court, but in a clumsy, half-remembered Bulgarian, its Cyrillic script a defiant act of memory. He wrote of his village, of his parents, of the journey, of the beatings, of the fear, of the unmaking. It was a torrent, a confession to a God he no longer believed in, a desperate attempt to reclaim the boy he had been forced to kill. "I learned to forget my mother's lullabies," he wrote, his hand shaking. "I replaced them with Arabic prayers that felt like stones in my mouth." But forgetting was survival, and survival was the only virtue the palace taught. The envoy's route took them within a day's ride of Koprivshtitsa. An overwhelming compulsion seized him. On the pretext of inspecting a local garrison, he broke away from the main party, taking only a single trusted guard, a fellow product of the Devşirme. The village was both the same and irrevocably different. The church was there, but the bell tower was new. The cobbled streets were familiar, yet they felt alien under his fine leather boots. He found the lane where his house had stood. It was gone, replaced by another small, unremarkable home. He asked a stooped old woman, her face a web of wrinkles, about the Pavlov family. She looked at him with wary, suspicious eyes. "Pavel and Elena?" she said, her voice a dry rasp. "Gone. Long ago. The collectors took their son. They say Elena lost her mind with grief. She would wander the forests calling his name, Stefan, until the winter took her. Pavel, he died a year later. A broken heart, the priest said. The old woman's words were like shards of glass in his gut. He had survived. He had climbed the ladder of power. And for what? To stand as a stranger in the ruins of his own life. His success built on the foundation of his parents' agony. The splendor the Aga had promised was a hollow mockery. He turned away, his composure finally shattering. The guard, a man named Yusuf who had once been a Greek boy named Nikos, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Pasha," Yusuf said softly, "there is nothing for you here." Süleyman looked at his guard, and for the first time, he saw not a subordinate, but a fellow ghost, another man haunted by a stolen past. In that shared, silent understanding, a flicker of the humanity he thought he had lost was rekindled. The journey back to Istanbul was not as a triumphant official, but as a man carrying the full weight of his history, the ghost of Stefan walking beside him every step of the way. Decades later, Grand Vizier Süleyman Pasha sat in his opulent chambers in the Topkapi Palace. The walls were hung with priceless silks, the air was fragrant with expensive incense, and the papers on his desk held the fates of millions. He had reached the zenith of power, second only to the Sultan himself. He was the ultimate testament to the Devşirme system, a Christian slave boy transformed into the most powerful man in the empire. He often walked the palace grounds at night, a solitary, haunted figure. He would pass the dormitories of the Enderun, hearing the faint, restless sounds of the new generation of boys, a fresh crop of stolen childhoods being harvested for the empire's needs. He saw the system with a terrible clarity now, a self-perpetuating machine of trauma, where the abused were forged into the next generation of abusers, their loyalty to the Sultan cemented by their complete severance from any other source of identity or love. The splendor of the Ottoman court, the art, the architecture, the poetry, the intricate bureaucracy that European observers so admired. It was all inextricably linked to this dark engine of human suffering. The empire did not just run on taxes and military victories. It ran on the psychological destruction of children. The story of Stefan and the countless others like him is not just a historical footnote. It is a chilling reminder of how institutional violence, cloaked in the language of opportunity and civilization, can become the foundation of a great power. The paradox of the Devşirme, that victims became oppressors, that personal advancement was tied to institutional cruelty, is a pattern that echoes through history, from the child soldiers of modern conflicts to the hidden abuses in residential schools and other total institutions. Today, millions of tourists walk through the gilded courtyards of the Topkapi Palace. They photograph the spoonmaker's diamond, marvel at the sacred relics, and admire the intricate Ottoman miniatures in climate-controlled galleries. They stand in spaces where boys were lined up like livestock for inspection, where their futures were decided by the predatory gaze of powerful men. They walk past the infirmary where children were castrated and the dungeons where they were broken. The official histories, the museum placards, and the tour guides speak of an elite educational institution, of a meritocracy that allowed the talented to rise regardless of their birth. They do not speak of the blood tax, of the sexualized servitude, of the stolen generations. But if you listen closely in the quiet halls of the palace, you can almost hear the echoes of a history that refuses to be completely silenced. It is in the sorrowful cadence of an old Balkan folk song, in the defiant scratch of a Cyrillic letter on a hidden scrap of paper, in the whispered prayers of a boy trying to remember his mother's face. It is the story of Stefan, and of the hundreds of thousands of castrated playdolls and branded boys whose stolen lives and broken bodies were the true, terrible price of imperial splendor. Their ghosts still walk the gilded halls, a silent testament to the tortures that built an empire. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. See you in the next one.